Hey, John. Look, thanks for coming in. I always enjoy times we get to talk and riff about what you do and what I do, and try and find those intersections. We've got a fair bit to talk about today. I've got a few questions here. I might read some of them just to make sure I set the context right. So you've got a PhD in clinical psychology. So it's fair to say that you probably have spent a little bit of time thinking about human behaviour. In previous modules in this course, we've talked a lot about human behaviour and about Kurt Lewin's work and around the complexity of humans, about driving forces and restraining forces, and how hard it is for clinical psychology. It's about understanding humans and getting them to get to a point from A to B. What I'd really like to talk about in this conversation is how do we influence humans and shift their choices and behaviours? Kurt Lewin's work in the 1960s sort of lifted the veil a little bit about that, but that was a long time ago, 60 years ago. So I'd love just to start off with maybe just a little bit about you and your journey to here, but then within that, tell that story about your understanding, unfold your understanding of human behaviour, and how you think that has changed from what you learned about the theory, Kurt Lewin's theory, and before that, and where we're at now in terms of your own story of that journey.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. I mean, I have a background in psychology, and as a youngster growing up, I was always fascinated by people, and I enjoyed not just talking to others, but actually understanding a bit about their dare I say, their problems. But by that I mean I was really curious about how, myself included, we all make decisions. Then sometimes maybe it's my friends or whoever, I was like, why are you doing that? Or why aren't you doing this? And I'm like, if only I could have a way of helping perhaps myself or yourself understand more about the implications of the decisions we make, and how just by thinking things through slightly differently can make a big difference in your life. And that's kind of what attracted me to psychology. And I was very lucky to end up working for a group at the University of Queensland who developed the PPE positive parenting program, which for me is one of the great innovations in applied psychology in the world, and it's right here in Queensland. And what that really showed me, and Professor Matt Sanders, who developed it, and the team, was that you can take knowledge about human behaviour, in this case it was about, of course, parents and their children, and package that up in a certain way and think about systems of deployment or implementation, and make a big difference in people's lives, but also generate a revenue base on the back of that, which enables more innovation to occur. And so that's kind of the background. But what's really where we're coming from with Evidn is that we believe that many of the biggest problems and challenges that the world is facing at the moment, somewhere along the line, boil down to the way people think or behave. And the extent to which we can understand that pattern of thinking or behaviour is going to be really important with respect to how we formulate solutions. And that's the missing link for us at the moment, is that many of the solutions, whether it's in climate policy, whether it's in finance, whether it's in technology or health or many other sectors, are missing a critical piece about the analysis and understanding of human behaviour. And so Evidn as a company was set up to do two things: understand how you do that analysis and what people are thinking and what might be restraining people from acting or doing a certain thing, and how do you develop strategies with people to bring about behavioural change.
Yeah, great. So most people are going to be watching this and have not got a degree or a PhD in psychology. Can you take us through, you've got a behavioural science business that you've created, a consulting business, and I guess as your tools of trade, understanding humans is what you do as a company. Can you take us through some of the tools and tactics that you think are that someone who maybe isn't a psychologist or hasn't done a clin psych degree or PhD, what's the process? I mean, you used the word before, which I love, is you use this word, you were curious. Yeah. And I use the word curious a lot. Innovators are curious. Oh. They're curious maybe about how things work, but you indicated you're curious about why do people do things they do? Why do they make their decisions? So can you take us through some of the fundamental tools that you use, and you use in your business to really understand humans, and how does that help you get that more rounder understanding of this critical problem that needs to be solved?
A further thought here that is really important, and I believe it's material that has otherwise been covered, but it's to do with when we're thinking about understanding behaviour or trying to change it, we're often thinking about what the benefits are. or how to incentivize people to some change. Yet the evidence in psychology is very clear that it's those restraining forces or the barriers, as Kurt Lewin talked about in his field theory, that matter far more than what the benefits are. And so there's this default inclination we all have. I think we have it whether we're creating new products or services or technologies, or whether we're having conversations with our friends and trying to convince them to do something differently, that we default to the benefits. And those things, while important, are going to pale in significance compared to what you're asking people to let go of, to what you're asking people to sacrifice, to people where we're kind of stuck in, whether we like it or not, for various reasons, a bit of a status quo bias, right? And it's all to do with our routines and how we set up our lives and so forth. And so when we're thinking about how to make an impact or a change in people, be thinking about what's restraining them or the barriers to them adopting your technology or making some sort of change.
Yeah, no, that's great. The idea around restraining forces and driving forces is, was one of the key aha moments for me, is working out, well, usually when you develop a new product, you're telling people how good it is, but you're not recognizing that there's this comes down to some of Daniel Kahneman's work, which is there's a risk aversion. So I don't want to try something new because what I've got maybe isn't brilliant, but it's working, and I'm not prepared to take a risk because I'm not prepared to I don't believe you, or my need isn't great enough. And so understanding that trade-off between driving forces and restraining forces, I think, is really key, and we've talked about that a lot in this course already. But I'd love to understand this whole idea around, because it can seem like an insurmountable task of trying to change the world. Like, you can't change the world, you can't change millions of people. Millions of people is made up of millions of individual humans. We talk in innovation a lot about early adopters, about where do you start? Like, how do you find the first people who maybe have a higher likelihood of changing? And I'm interested just in your thoughts around this idea around mindsets of people, and where do you start if you've actually got a program? And I know you've worked in the cane industry, and you work in obviously parenting, and you're working in lots of sectors all around the world. Where do you start at a n=1 or n=10 sort of view of finding those early adopters who you think, okay, we need to start somewhere? Who is most likely to change first? And if it's a new technology, new product, then you need to start somewhere.
Yeah, by definition, as we know, early adopters are relatively rare. And there's many reasons for that. And one of them is that sense of risk that comes from being an early adopter. And by nature, we humans are risk averse. And there's a lot of evidence and research that's done just on that point. But what are the risks there are of being an early adopter, right? So it's to do with, okay, well, there could be a cost involved. There could be some sort of social status involved, that if you take on this new thing or this new position or whatever it is, that you might jeopardize where you stand in your community or with your friends or whatever it is. And there's potential for ridicule, for example, by being part of something that doesn't eventually go anywhere. But ultimately, the thought here is you've got to start somewhere. And the biggest insurmountable problems often do boil down to ultimately a handful of people that can affect actually quite a lot of change. And so in the work that we're most inclined to do will be in a particular sector, like say a farming community of far north of Queensland. And that could encompass thousands of different farmers, their families, the communities they live in, across hundreds, maybe 1,000 kilometres of coastline, for example, that's a part of that area. And so our focus there is firstly through developing, partnerships at the outset of key groups. And I go back to that point about the significant importance of what do we know about the groups that already exist in an area. So is there a farming group? Are there local government groups? Are there others? And they are wonderful sources of information and frankly intel about who's who. And then it's a process that I sometimes describe of being a bit like a Sherlock Holmes, of going into the community. And this is a big point as well, that we talk about engagement or how do you understand a problem. There's only so much you can do from afar. That change, as sometimes we say, is a contact sport. You got to be there. Doesn't mean you have to live there, because you can't live in every community. But if you're genuinely interested in people and you're genuinely interested in working with a group of people to bring about change, it's amazing how receptive people will be to you being there and how much they're willing to share. Because people like sharing their story, right? They like to share their perspective generally. There are always exceptions to that. But if you're a genuine source of interest, then that overcomes most barriers. And through that process of interviewing a few people to begin with, you have this sort of cascading effect that plays out where you learn a lot about a place rather quickly. And you start to do rapid testing of, okay, I've heard this person is influential, so I'll go and meet her or him or whoever it is. And from there, we'll test whether they'd be willing to share this message, or can they convene a group around them and get feedback and signal straight away from that community about, is this person actually up for this and can we work with them or not? So it's a constant. You've got to start somewhere, focus on groups, and test and iterate quickly is the way we go about it.
Yeah. And do you find that those first group of people that put their hand up and say, yeah, I'm interested in this, do they have, are there sort of similarities even in different contexts, that they are a certain type of person?
I think so. I think the similarities that are there is that they have a willingness to take some risks. And that's one of the biggest features. And there's quite a bit of psychology about that, as we know. But they're at a minimum believe strongly enough in what it is that we're trying to achieve, and remembering the work that we do is generally trying to bring about some benefit to that community or that group of people, and maybe something in the environment around them or in the health sector or whatever it might be. So there's a mutual benefit there to begin with. And so I think that's the first thing, is that you've been able to distill. And I think if there's one thing that has been really important for us throughout the work that we've done, is that we've been able to work out within people that what is the current barrier, or maybe you might call it restraining force, that they perceive as a big issue for their betterment or improvement or progression, or call it what you will, for themselves personally or that community. And if you can tap into that, it can be a very powerful thing. And by means of an example, with some of the work that we did with the sugar industry in the far north of Queensland, there was enormous pressure on that industry to change its farming practices and adopt new technologies and so forth to improve the Great Barrier Reef. And one of the reasons that was blocking that widespread adoption of good practices that are beneficial for the farmer, beneficial for the environment, is that there was a sense in the farming community that by adopting these things, because of all that pressure, that they were kind of suggesting that, or agreeing to the fact that they were in the wrong, that they had been doing bad things, and therefore by signing up to all these programs and taking advantage of the incentives, that they were putting their hands up and saying, yep, we're guilty as charged, and now here we go, we'll do the right thing, thank you for helping us, the community at large. Of course, that's not going to be helpful, and that's what the farmers felt. So we tapped into the farmers who were influential, and they would never identify themselves as influential, but we found that through our process, and worked out that the narrative really here, what we're hearing is these farmers want a chance to set the record straight, without being too cliche about it, but it's about we're good farmers, we're good people, and they are, and we want to be seen in a positive light, which they should be, and we want an opportunity to do that. And so we framed involvement in the uptake of what's called best management practice programs around this notion of setting the record straight. And we saw one of the biggest upticks in voluntary participation in these programs on the back of that.
Yeah, great. That's awesome. So I guess part of the key issue though is what is the problem you need to solve here? So you can't necessarily go up to a sugarcane farmer or a parent, who's making bad choices, or someone who's in a company and they're creating new products. No one creates a new product because they want it to fail. I mean, so sugarcane farmers don't want to be bad farmers, like you say, they don't. But they can't necessarily tell you what is that barrier, what are those restraining forces. So and without giving us a 3-year psychology undergraduate degree or a PhD, what's some of those ways that how do you actually get people to share with you what the problem is? Like, because they're not going to tell you, can't just ask them what's the problem, because that sounds too easy.
The first thing, and I say this with the greatest of respect, but we don't take anything anyone says to us very seriously with respect to our knowledge of our ability as human beings, and this is my ability as well as it is anybody else's, to self-reflect accurately is really poor. So our ability to understand what makes us happy, sad, angry, what we really want in life and what have you is so contextually dependent. It can vary so much, and we're often very wrong in our own assessment of that, let alone our ability to really tap into that knowledge, if you will, even if you had a 20/20 internal vision, and be able and willing to express that to someone else. because that act is another whole behavior, right? Where you've got to be able to articulate it, have the right words, know how to phrase it. And the person that you're speaking to needs to hear what you've said and decode it correctly, that what you really meant was this. There's so much going on there. The margin for error is enormous. And so we're far less interested in what people say. We are interested in what they do and what they don't do. We're interested in what their friends say about what they do, or their partners, or their children, or when we speak to advisors that might be working with farmers, or patients that are working with doctors, or whatever the circumstance is that we're trying to understand the behaviour. But what we've got to do is find the single most fundamental thing that if we change in terms of a behaviour is going to make a difference here. And we need to start with one thing. And there can be so many of those, and there can be so many different behaviours of different people in a system, because as we know, a lot of these issues are what some people refer to as system level problems, right? There's lots of things going on, but you need to somehow be mindful of that and find at least a starting point with a behaviour and a group of people and go from there.
Yeah, great. And so I love this idea around the village or the ecosystem and trying to poke and prod around there to get this contextual understanding of the problem. And there's not potentially, it may be one thing that one person says, which you can then now interrogate with lots of other conversations. But ultimately, the answer is not necessarily in the human whose behaviour you might be wanting to influence and change.
Yeah. Indeed. And a thought here is about how, frankly, useless things like surveys and pop-up boxes for people to tell us your view on X, Y, or Z are in informing design. And I'd caution anybody who's wanting to do user-centered or person-engaged or all of these other terms that are used, programs who rely solely on those outlets. And by means of an example, I was at an event recently from a big transport company, aviation company, who was talking about carbon offsetting. And they revealed some data about asking passengers, actual passengers, how many would be willing to pay for carbon offsetting, for example, and the design of such programs. And it was well over 50%. And the data that they have indicate that fewer than 10% of people actually pay for it. So just as that example alone, just because you've got people reporting and responding to surveys that are telling they're willing to do something, not willing to do something, means very little about what people are actually going to do. So you have to look at what people do, less about asking what they think.
Yeah, that's excellent. So can you talk to us a little bit about, because when I talk to people about innovation and talk about what's about behavioural change and influencing behavioural change or changing behaviour, some people say, well, hang on, what's the ethics associated with that? Like, you know, what right do I have to say to you that you're a bad parent, or what right do you have to say that the way you're doing your job is not right, or the way you're farming in North Queensland is wrong? Yeah. How do you sort of approach this? Because it's sort of sensitive, isn't it? Because the marketing industry uses behavioural change all the time, trying to get us to do something we actually don't want to do and don't need to do, but we do because of some sort of behavioural change strategy they've got. Yeah. So talk to us about in the industry, in this sort of profession of psychology and behavioural change, how do you navigate the ethics of that?
I think we've got a distinction here between when behaviour change is done to people versus when it's done with them. And this all goes back to the decisions at the outset of what this program or initiative is that we're attempting to undertake. So when things are done to people, they're generally not just consulted, but they're not engaged in any meaningful way. And there's a whole thing we could explore there in terms of, you're seeing at the moment in the energy sector in particular, there's a lot of public outcry from communities that are having transmission lines, solar farms and other things imposed upon it. And governments and others are saying we've engaged with the community or developers and we've had a consultation process that's undertaken, and the community saying we've never heard of it, we've never seen of it, there's only a handful of people that knew about it or were invited, and so on and so forth. So there's this mismatch between when something's being done to a group or an individual versus when it's done with them. And I think one of the things we've been we've at least tried very hard to do as best as we can is, how do you design programs with people from the outset? And that is a very laborious task. And I say it in a very positive sense, not in a, like it's a dreadful thing to do, but rather it's manual labour. You need to be there with people, meeting them in some form, or at least in that group setting, understanding who's can be a messenger back to the group. That's the way we can get social norms creating and a cascading flow of information. And so I think the moment you have that approach, But above all, one of the things that we set as a non-negotiable with the work that we do is, are we genuinely interested in this group of people, and do we genuinely believe that we can help in some way? Now, we are a for-profit organisation. We're not a not-for-profit. We're not a social enterprise in that way. But core to what we do is thinking we need to actually have a genuine belief and understanding in the group that we're working with, or we won't take that work on, for starters. So I think that won't entirely answer the ethical question, but it certainly helps me sleep better at night if I know that we're out there with a genuine interest and trying to develop things with people that they not only have a say into, but it's for mutual gain in the first instance. The broader point there, perhaps more nuts and bolts, is it's about the voluntary nature of it. I think we have another issue in behavioural science more broadly, and this might be more in the domain of what I consider the relatively narrow field of behavioural economics, which is the more finance subsection of behavioural science, but sometimes used to describe the broader field, is this idea that we change settings, or there's some of this is to do with nudge theory, for example, that therefore more or less everybody's presented with a new option or the new way of doing something, which they technically still have choice. That's a whole other point, though, about to what extent is it a choice, if it's a default and all those sorts of things. But the more that we can make it voluntary, and people need to self-regulate their own involvement in that, the better.
Yeah, no, that's great. And what I really love about that is that when we're talking about innovation and you're talking about developing new products and services, like, it's really hard. Like, 60 or 80 years ago, if you created a new fashion item, I mean, there wasn't massive factories all around the world creating fashion items, every minute of every day. And so it largely was successful. New consumer products, new software products, new technology products. But now there's just so much competition that just creating a new product doesn't actually cut through. And so what I talk to a lot about is how do you enlist the crowd? If you do something that someone loves, if they love it enough, then they're going to enlist their friends. They're going to tell people about it. It's the old school analog word of mouth. Just having a great email campaign is not necessarily going to cut it. And so what I like how you're describing is this doing it with, not for. Yeah. And I think that's actually really, really interesting around innovation is a group sport. It's not just doing it for one person. It's actually doing it with people. An
interesting reflection there that I have, Cam, we work a bit in the energy sector, and we're often asked about, well, how do we scale this, right? I appreciate what you're saying, John, and we've got communities and people and groups and all this sort of thing, but goodness me, there's 100,000 people that live in this regional town, and they're spread out over this massive geographic landscape and whatnot, and they're wanting to put in, say, a series of wind farms and all that goes with their transmission lines. And I say, well, this is a big undertaking, and as it ought to be. And could you tell me the cost of the wind farms and the engineering and the approvals and the maintenance and the ongoing requirements for putting all of that in? And it runs into the tens of millions or whatever it might be. And I'd say, well, wouldn't it be an entirely appropriate thing that you had a behavioural science built into this, a community understanding community that might be $1 million a year or whatever it is? I'm just making up the numbers for the case in point. But we should be thinking about this in terms of, this is a very serious consideration. It's not just a bolt-on thing that we do as part of a program. And I'm talking more about the social change, behavioural change work that we're involved with. But I think that's really important, is to consider the fact that we've got the wrong anchoring on this, that we need to be thinking about the significance of bringing people with us is hugely intensive, and it needs expertise, and it needs people in place to be able to help with that in an ongoing way.
Yeah, and I like that idea is that it's who and why focused, not necessarily what and how focused.
Yeah,
you need the what and the how to get scale.
Yeah,
but if you don't have the who and the why actually makes the who want to tell their other friends. And I love in the interview I did with Andrew Barnes from Go One. They got into Y Combinator and they were looking for the secret sauce of how do you create a unicorn, how do you create a great company.
Yeah.
And they thought that there'd be this formula, that would be a secret formula. And the guys at YC said it's actually pretty straightforward. Just build something that lots of people love.
Right.
If lots of people love it, then it's going to be successful.
Yep.
Like, it doesn't matter how good your strategy is, your how is, or your what is. If people don't love it, then it's not going anywhere. So I'd love to finish with just some of your reflections on this scale question, because we're talking about understanding people. We understand people for a reason. You want to make changes. You want to help them improve their life in some way. But ultimately, that understanding is great at an n=1 or n=10 or whatever it is. But have you got any reflections, maybe from your experience with Triple P or some of the other projects you're working in, as to that idea around scale. How do we take that understanding and get it operating at scale, and maybe thinking about what you maybe learned from the PPP experience as to, well, how did that work?
Well, I think PPP, firstly, is one of the great examples of a scaled applied psychology intervention anywhere in the world. And what the group there, and this is a really profound thing, I think, did, perhaps better than any other group that I've seen. And the founder of this program, Matt Sanders, when he was starting out, had this insight as a clinical psychologist who was very interested in child development, and said, look, I know a lot about the interactions between parents and children and what can make that better and help children grow up to be happier and healthier and all those sorts of things. And if I was to see in my private practice parents and their children all day, every day, for the rest of my career, I would hopefully make a positive influence on those families for sure, but I'd probably do nothing at scale. That is, I'd do nothing to reduce the population level prevalence of social, emotional, and behavioural problems. And it was that insight that he had that led to the creation of the PPP system of implementation and dissemination, essentially. And that is how to package up the knowledge, move well beyond one consulting psychologist that got it into the hands, this knowledge that is, and the program and the manuals and the materials into thousands of psychologists right around the world, or even transport it online and make it a self-regulated system that parents could work through. So the insight that I got there was not only how psychology can be scaled through systems of dissemination, but it was this idea of starting with the end in mind. And that's something that we're attempting to do as well. And the vision there for PPP was we want to improve the lives of every child on earth. So that is scale, I think. Yeah. And so that when we set about a program, I'm not sure if our vision for any one particular thing that we're working on is as grand as that, what gets grander than improving the lives of every child on earth. But we'll go, okay, we're working with this particular region or community or organization. What is the end game here that we're aiming for? We'd like an X% change of this behaviour. We want to see water quality improved by so much in the Great Barrier Reef, or whatever the metric is. And then and we think about, okay, well, what do we have set up given the context that we're operating in, right? That often we think about the partnerships that we're involved with a government department, for example, or maybe a big NGO that have a certain window of time, a certain budget, and they want to affect change at scale. That's typically the ingredients that precede us becoming involved. So given all that contextual information, which is really important in terms of how you design something that can fit in place, we then think about, well, who do we need to involve? What are the design decisions of the strategies that we can realistically deploy? How much budget can we apply to certain outreach or marketing material? The list goes on. But the point being that when we have that end in mind, it influences every decision. And from right back to the beginning. And what's really important about that is that when you start to become fixated on that end goal, you move well out of the traditions of, say, research or academia, where the end in mind probably has a different ceiling to what we're talking about if we're really out there in the wild, so to speak. And I think that's an important thing that we've tried to do. And one of the reasons that we started Evidn as a private firm is it in many ways took that ceiling away, because we were left with the reality of having to bring about ideas and strategies that can actually work at scale.
Yeah, that's awesome, John. Look, that's been such a great conversation, and I'm in love with this idea of the how and the how and the what, sort of subservient to the who and the why. And I really loved how you started off just off the cuff with this curiosity. Yeah. And we find that people who are innovators, they're curious. And they might start with being curious about how does AI work. They might be curious in the what or the how. How do we sort of develop a business model that's in the cloud? But ultimately, fundamentally, what I learned from you and from your field, and what I learned from successful innovators, is that it is very human-centered, but not just an individual. It's actually within the context that they're in. And I think that's what psychology is, I guess, is understanding humans within their context. And recognizing that there's lots of things around the outside, and you can't just have one little widget that's actually going to necessarily change someone's life. Yeah. So look, John, you've been really generous with your time. I love talking to you, and I look forward to working more with you in the future.
Thank you, Ken.
Great.
Thank you.